When we think about transgender athletes, we think about a physically able bodied man competing in female sports. Bigger jawline, broader shoulders, bigger hands, more muscle, bigger body. And naturally, we think, how fair is that? That person's competing against female athletes that have smaller bodies, less muscle mass. That's not fair. And if that person wins, we definitely think that's unfair, or at least I think that's unfair. And this is what happened with Lia Thomas at UPenn. Lia Thomas is a biological man and competed as a man for UPenn's swim team as recent as 2020. And then in 2019, Lia Thomas started transitioning, undertaking hormonal therapy, and came out as a woman shortly thereafter. And Leia started competing as a woman. And within 2 years, won the NCAA Women's Championship in swimming. But the Trump administration issued a ban on transgender athletes competing in women's sports. This led to UPenn stripping Leia of her titles and issuing a formal apology. Actually, I believe it was the NCAA who stripped Leia of her titles. And again, it makes sense. Someone who's biologically male competing in a female sport who competed with other men just a few years ago makes it so unfair to other female athletes of the sport. And Lia Thomas is nothing new. Men competing in female sports goes back to, I believe, the 1930s, where some men did dress up as women to compete in female sports. Now, I think most people would be 100% against that. But when we start looking at the data and the research, there are a lot of questions that come up that I'd love to pose to you to see what you think as well. For example, in 2024, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport found, first, there are no long-term studies tracking trans athletes post-transition. I can imagine in the future, there will be more trans athletes clamoring for their inclusion into sport. But the reality is, we actually don't know what the impact is post-transition. Now, to step back from this for a second, when I think of male and female athletes, I know that there's a spectrum of male and female athletes physiologically that are much more pronounced than others. The LeBron James in the NBA, the Serena Williams in tennis, China in the WWE. These people have bigger bodies, they have more muscle mass compared to other biological men and biological women in their own category. Their lean body mass, their height, they all play a role. In the same study, it also found that women who are taller than 5'10" have more muscle mass than biological women who are 5'4" and shorter. But there's no rule on ruling out taller women from competition than shorter to equally compete with shorter women. And so it can be very unfair if a shorter by height female team is competing with a taller by height female team in a competition, say it's on strength based, that could play an unfair advantage within biological females. And the number one reason that many have said men and women should be separated from sports is because of the exposure men have during their adolescent years towards testosterone and circular testosterone. This leads to greater bone density, greater lung capacity, more muscle mass during an explosion of growth. But although those are factors, it doesn't necessarily translate into elite athletic performance, interestingly enough. Because if women started training, say, at a younger age, the results in elite athletic performance in certain sports may actually be somewhat comparable. Now you might be asking, Christopher, how do you know that? That makes no sense, etc. Okay, so look at this. This is a graph of marathon times from men and women from the 1960s, I think, up until 2010. And you can see for yourself that the times for women have dramatically come down, almost aligned with men today. Now, there's of course many reasons for this. I assume that in the 1960s, there were not as many female athletes, say, from the developing world competing, specifically from the African continent. I could be wrong. But other examples could be that courses have changed so that it's more okay for men and women, as an example. Or it could also be that there's been an explosion in sport companies like Nike and others training athletes at a younger age, specifically female athletes, that can play a real role in marathon runners competing at a high level and those numbers coming down. So it could be that training started at an earlier age for females and as a result are now much more aligned with male marathon times. And so when we start unpacking the research, we start finding that there's a lot of complexity even looking at elite athletic performance within male and female sex categories. And so perhaps banning trans athletes isn't the operative term. The operative term is suspend trans athletes until we know more, until we can undertake longitudinal studies that are third-party peer-reviewed, etc., enough times across enough different settings to then say, this is our hard and fast rule for trans athletes and their inclusion in sport. And maybe that's a suspension of 10 to 15 years to allow the research to catch up to what we want to include in sport. It could be that hormonal therapy puts trans athletes at an unfair advantage against women, and they must compete against men. Or we might find that hormonal therapy has no impact. Or we might find that additional tests for transgender athletes on a series of biological markers is needed prior to letting them compete. And maybe those tests are based on the competition that they find themselves in. For example, weightlifting versus swimming versus competitive combative sports versus badminton or tennis. I just think that the tests need to be relevant to the sport that they're involved in. The last thing I'll say about all of this is I think that this can very well lead to charter challenges in the future, right? A trans athlete may very well say that banning them from competing in a sport at the highest level is a charter violation. They're no longer allowed to live their life to their fullest, life, liberty, and security of the person. And for some, that sounds absurd. But I know that these court cases take on a life of their own, and a decision from the Supreme Court will most likely directly impact public policy moving forward. So to get ahead of that eventual court case that I see happening, why don't we start saying we need more data that's robust enough for us to make hard and fast rules of transgender athletes in sport? I feel like banning lends itself to a Supreme Court case because it's very inflammatory, but really we should openly acknowledge that we don't have the answers. But I'd love to know what you think about this and about the research that is available. I'll link below, but let me know what you think about trans athletes in sport, what you think the better policy is. Like, share, and comment. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next one.